By the time Leif Ericson and his crew had returned from their first voyage to Vinland, the memory of the fertile shores and the dense forests lingered in every mind. Greenland felt smaller somehow, colder and harsher, after glimpsing the generous lands across the Atlantic. The men spoke of the forests stretching endlessly, of rivers teeming with salmon, of grapes hanging in clusters heavy enough to stain fingers purple. Yet they also spoke of the Skraelings, the wary native people who had watched their every move with suspicion, and of the clashes that had reminded them that abundance alone could not secure a foothold. For Leif, the call of Vinland became almost irresistible. He knew that there were resources to be gathered, timber to be harvested, and knowledge to be gained from a land so rich and untamed. More than that, he saw an opportunity to expand the Norse presence beyond Greenland and Iceland. Stories of Vinland's promise spread through the settlements, captivating not only his immediate crew, but other Norse families and merchants, eager for new ventures and adventure. Preparations for the second voyage were meticulous. Leif selected men who had endured the first journey and could be trusted with both the safety of the crew and the challenges that lay ahead. Farmers accustomed to labor, hunters skilled with bows and axes, and sailors familiar with the moods of the North Atlantic seas were called. Each was informed that this journey was no longer a fleeting exploration. It was an attempt to establish a more permanent presence in a land whose abundance could sustain families and livestock alike. The ships were rebuilt and reinforced. Oak planks were inspected for cracks, sails checked for holes, and hulls caulked with pitch to ensure no water seeped in. Provisions were gathered with care, salted and dried fish from Greenland's coast, barrels of butter and cheese, flour for baking bread, and skins to keep warm. Ale was stored in casks, and tools of every sort, axes, hammers and saws, were loaded alongside weapons. Leif knew that beyond the open sea, the success of the voyage would depend as much on preparation as on courage. Word of Vinland reached far across the settlements, and the allure of a new land prompted a surge of volunteers. Some came for the promise of wealth, timber for trade, furs for markets, or land to cultivate. Others were motivated by curiosity to witness the wonders that Leif had described. The forests that seemed endless, the berries that could stain one's lips, the rivers where salmon leapt freely. Each man carried his own hope, and each contributed to the collective excitement and tension that filled Greenland's shores. By the time spring had fully arrived, the Nar, the same broad-bellied cargo ship that had carried Leif and his men before, was ready. Leif stood at the prow, the wind tugging at his tunic, the smell of salt and pitch thick in the air. Behind him the crew moved with purpose, tightening ropes, stacking barrels, and murmuring prayers for safe passage. Though the Atlantic remained unpredictable, each man felt a renewed sense of determination, tempered by the knowledge of past perils. The departure from Greenland was solemn, yet filled with anticipation. Families waved from the rocky cliffs, some shedding tears, others whispering blessings. The icy fjords faded into the distance, replaced by open waters and the ceaseless motion of waves. The first few days were calm, offering respite from the harsh Greenlandic winters, but the crew knew that the Atlantic could turn violent without warning. They remained vigilant, scanning the horizon, adjusting sails, and checking provisions, understanding that survival depended on constant attention and cooperation. Navigation relied on skills honed over years. The North Star guided them at night. The flight of birds suggested nearby land, and the subtle changes in watercolor hinted at shoals or deeper currents. The sunstone, if legends were true, was used to detect the sun's position through clouds, offering a glimpse of clarity in otherwise uncertain conditions. Each decision on course, on when to row, when to raise the sail, carried weight. Misjudgment could result in disaster. Yet the crew trusted in Leif's leadership, the experience etched into his every movement and command. Weeks passed. Storms tested both ship and men, waves slammed against the Nar, and rain whipped across faces, soaking clothing and chilling bones. Crew members clung to ropes, bailed water from the deck, and offered steady hands to each other, murmuring encouragement in the tongue of the north. At times, the sea seemed endless, a grey expanse swallowing the horizon, yet the vision of Vinland, the land they had glimpsed and dreamed of, kept spirits alive. Each sunrise brought hope, and each sunset a reminder that progress had been made. Finally, the familiar signs appeared. Gulls circled overhead, their calls piercing the wind. A faint green smudge on the horizon hinted at forests beyond the reach of sight. Fingers stained with anticipation pointed, and hearts quickened. The Nar approached the coastline, and as land came into focus, awe swept over the crew. Rolling hills, dense woods, and beaches untouched by human hands stretched before them. Vinland was not a mirage, it was real, and it awaited their careful claim and careful exploration. The first landfall was cautious. Leif and a small contingent of men disembarked to scout the immediate shore, eyes scanning for signs of scralings or other dangers. The soil was soft, rich with vegetation, and streams of fresh water trickled from higher hills. Trees offered timber, berries were abundant, and grapes hung heavy on their vines. Each step confirmed what they had dreamed of. The land was generous, fertile, and capable of sustaining life far better than Greenland ever could. As the camp was established, the men worked quickly yet deliberately. Temporary shelters of turf and timber were erected, hearths were prepared, and storage for food was organized. The Nar was anchored safely, with barrels and casks unloaded, creating a floating storehouse that could return to Greenland if necessary. Yet Vinland demanded attention beyond survival. It required understanding, observation, and careful diplomacy with the native Skrælings who might claim the land as their own. Encounters with the Skrælings began with cautious curiosity. Initial exchanges involved gifts, red cloth, metal tools, and milk, offered in gestures of friendship. In return, the Norse received animal skins, food, and lessons in the lay of the land. At first, these interactions were promising. Both groups measured each other with respect, wary yet intrigued. Leif understood that establishing a lasting presence depended not only on resourcefulness, but also on the ability to navigate these early interactions with patience and caution. However, tensions were never far. Misunderstandings arose quickly. A frightened animal, a disputed trade, or a perceived insult could ignite hostilities. The Norse carried weapons and training, a reminder to the Skrælings of their potential for violence. Each skirmish, however small, served as a lesson in caution and humility, underscoring that Vinland's abundance was matched by its uncertainties. Even as the forests provided wood and the rivers salmon, the land demanded respect and vigilance. Daily life in Vinland followed a rhythm shaped by both opportunity and caution. Men fished the rivers, hunted game, and explored the forests. Timber was gathered for construction and for shipment back to Greenland. Berries and grapes were harvested, and meals were shared around fires, where tales of past exploits and hopes for the future were exchanged. Nights were filled with watchfulness. The crew took turns guarding against surprise attacks, understanding that survival depended as much on vigilance as on strength. Through this delicate balance, the Norse began to imagine what Vinland could become. Could families settle here? Could livestock thrive? Could they return each season, gathering resources and knowledge that would eventually support permanent colonies? Such thoughts mingled with the reality of hostility and the unpredictable nature of life, in a land both generous and untamed. The tension between aspiration and practicality defined each decision, shaping the way the Norse approached every task, every encounter, and every venture into the wild. Leif Ericson, mindful of both ambition and caution, continued to explore and survey the land. He divided his crew into groups to map the coastline, catalogue resources, and observe the behavior of the Skraelings. Each expedition returned with reports. The land was fertile, the forests vast, the rivers plentiful, but the people wary and sometimes aggressive. The promise of Vinland remained, yet it was clear that ambition had to be tempered with prudence. Even as the days passed, Vinland's essence was revealed. The land offered sustenance beyond what Greenland could ever provide, but it also demanded negotiation, courage, and adaptability. Each dawn brought opportunity, and each sunset reflected the reality that survival here was not guaranteed. The Norse had discovered a new world, but discovering it was only the first step. Living within it, with all its beauty and danger, would be the true measure of success. Leif and his men spent weeks establishing routines: fishing, hunting, harvesting, building, and watching. They learned to read the behavior of animals, the flow of the rivers, and the signals of the Skraelings. They discovered wild berries, grapes, and other fruits, each adding to the richness of their diet. Timber was felled carefully, stored for construction, and sometimes prepared for transport back to Greenland. The Gnar became a lifeline, a mobile store of resources and a symbol of connection to home. Through careful management and cautious diplomacy, Leif's second voyage to Vinland illustrated both the potential and the limitations of the New World. The land was rich, forests vast, rivers bountiful, and the soil fertile. Yet the Norse were few in number, and the presence of the Skraelings reminded them that territory was not easily claimed. Each day required balance between exploitation and restraint, between courage and prudence, between hope and survival. Vinland's bounty inspired dreams, yet tempered ambition, with lessons learned from the land itself and its inhabitants. The Norse understood that exploration was not conquest, that abundance came with responsibility, and that even the most generous land could challenge those who sought to inhabit it. As the days stretched into weeks, Leif Ericson and his crew built not just shelters, but knowledge, resilience, and a legacy that would endure in saga and memory, shaping the story of Vinland for generations to come. The days in Vinland grew longer as summer approached, sunlight lingering over the dense forests and open meadows. Life settled into a rhythm for Leif Ericson and his men, a mixture of labor, exploration, and cautious diplomacy. Each morning began with the chores necessary for survival: fishing in the rivers, hunting game, and tending to temporary shelters. Timber continued to be a prime resource, not just for immediate use in building structures, but also as a commodity to be transported back to Greenland. The forests seemed endless, filled with pines, oaks, and birches, their wood sturdy enough for ships, houses, and tools. Despite the abundance, Leif remained vigilant. The Skraelings, the native inhabitants of Vinland, watched the Norse closely, and occasional skirmishes reminded them that this land was not unclaimed. Trade continued in measured amounts, furs and pelts exchanged for iron tools, cloth, and milk. But every interaction carried the weight of mutual suspicion. The Norse understood that maintaining peace required patience, respect, and readiness, for any misstep could escalate into violence. Daily routines were punctuated with exploration. Leif sent small groups inland, mapping rivers, valleys, and the spread of fertile soil. Hunters reported deer, elk, and bears roaming freely. Fishermen marveled at salmon leaping in abundance. Berry bushes and wild grapes were discovered in clusters, the fruits ripe and plentiful. The abundance was intoxicating, yet Leif constantly reminded his men to respect the land, taking only what they needed and leaving traces as minimal as possible. Survival depended on balance, not exploitation. Evenings were filled with reflection and planning. Around the fires, the men shared stories from Greenland and Iceland, recounting past adventures and imagining what life could be like if Vinland were to support permanent settlement. Dreams of families living in these woods, of livestock grazing in clearings, and of children growing up among rivers and forests colored their conversations. Yet the spectre of danger remained. Scouting parties often returned with tales of skraelings moving silently through the woods, of sudden raids that required quick defense, and of disputes that escalated beyond simple trade disagreements. Leif's leadership was tested daily. He balanced ambition with caution, encouraging exploration while enforcing vigilance. The men respected his judgment, for they had witnessed his courage and wisdom during their first voyage. Yet even he knew that no amount of skill or preparation could make Vinland completely safe with such a small group and a persistent, watchful native population. The reality of their numbers against the unknown intentions of the skraelings was a constant, quiet tension beneath the surface of everyday activities. Harvesting the land became an exercise in both necessity and strategy. Grapes were picked carefully, salted fish stored properly, and timber felled with precision. Every resource was accounted for, as if each log or barrel could tip the balance between thriving and failing in this new world. Leif organized teams to collect supplies not only for immediate survival, but also for transport back to Greenland, ensuring that even if permanent settlement proved impossible, the journey would not have been in vain. The skraelings' presence, while sometimes intimidating, also offered lessons in local knowledge. Observing their movements, Leif's men learned the patterns of animal migration, the best spots for fishing, and the most fertile patches of soil. Trade interactions, though tense, allowed the Norse to understand local materials and methods, enriching their knowledge of Vinland's potential. In this way, Vinland taught as much as it provided, shaping the skills and awareness of every man present. Hunting expeditions became more daring as the crew grew accustomed to the terrain. Forests were explored with a mix of excitement and caution. Deer and elk were abundant, but ambushes by skraelings reminded hunters that vigilance was essential. The men carried iron weapons, shields and bows, prepared for confrontation, yet they also sought to observe without provoking unnecessary conflict. Each successful hunt reinforced confidence and strengthened the small community, while each close encounter reminded them of their precarious position in an unfamiliar land. Cultural exchange, even if limited, began to take shape. The Norse shared knowledge of ironworking, woodworking and navigation, while learning from the skraelings' familiarity with local flora, fauna and geography. Though full trust was never achieved and suspicion lingered, these interactions hinted at possibilities. A coexistence, if managed carefully, might be attainable, though the Norse remained aware that their small numbers placed them at a constant disadvantage. Life in Vinland also demanded resourcefulness in domestic tasks. Fires were maintained meticulously. Meals were prepared from a combination of gathered berries, hunted meat, and fish. Drinking water from streams had to be monitored for safety, and storage of food became a daily concern. The men worked together in teams, creating a sense of unity born from shared responsibility and mutual dependence. Even minor missteps could have serious consequences, reinforcing the importance of discipline and coordination. As weeks turned into months, the Norse developed a deeper understanding of Vinland's climate and seasons. Winters were milder than Greenland, yet still presented challenges. Snow would blanket the ground in colder months, rivers could freeze, and shelter became essential for survival. Leif planned accordingly, building sturdier shelters, stockpiling food, and preparing for long nights. The knowledge gained during these months was invaluable, forming the foundation of any hope for future settlement. Despite the caution and preparation, tension with the skraelings continued to simmer. Misunderstandings over resources, miscommunications during trade, and cultural differences occasionally erupted into minor conflicts. Arrows were sometimes fired, stones hurled, and defensive formations had to be maintained. The Norse realized that survival in Vinland was not simply a matter of exploiting its abundance. It required diplomacy, strategy, and restraint. Each encounter reinforced the lesson that the land, for all its generosity, was not unclaimed, and that coexistence would require more than good intentions. In this second chapter of Vinland, the Norse began to form a picture of what life could be. A balance of exploration, labor, and cautious interaction. The land offered food, timber, and opportunity, but it demanded vigilance, cooperation, and respect. Every task, from harvesting grapes to felling trees, from fishing to negotiating with the Skrælings, was an exercise in survival and judgment. Leif's leadership ensured that the men remained focused, disciplined, and aware of the stakes involved. As summer reached its height, the crew paused to reflect on their accomplishments. Shelters were secure, food supplies abundant, and knowledge of the land growing. They had observed the rhythms of rivers and forests, understood the presence and patterns of the Skrælings, and harvested resources that could sustain them for months. Yet the uncertainty of the future lingered. Would they be able to establish a permanent settlement, or would Vinland remain a seasonal venture, a land visited but not held? The question hung in the air as the Atlantic waves lapped against the shore, a reminder that the world beyond Greenland was as unpredictable as it was alluring. Evenings were marked by quiet conversation and storytelling. Men recounted past voyages, shared dreams of Vinland's potential, and discussed strategies for future exploration. Songs were sung around the fire, echoing across the meadows, binding the crew together in a shared identity forged by hardship and hope. Children, if any accompanied them in future expeditions, would one day learn these stories, shaping a Norse understanding of a land that was as rich in memory as in timber, grapes, and salmon. Leif understood that the legacy of Vinland would not be measured only in resources gathered or temporary settlements established. It would be measured in the knowledge gained, the skills honed, and the understanding of the land and its people. Each day in Vinland was a step in a journey that blended exploration with survival, hope with caution, and ambition with wisdom. The second voyage solidified the Norse presence, even if briefly, leaving an indelible mark on the saga of discovery and shaping the enduring story of Vinland. As autumn approached, Vinland transformed under a canopy of gold and amber. Leaves from birch, oak, and maple carpets the forest floor, crunching beneath the boots of Leif Ericson's men. The air grew crisp, carrying scents of pine, wet earth, and distant smoke from Skræling's fires. The Norse settlement, though modest, reflected months of labor. Turf-walled huts, timber-framed structures, and stacks of firewood ready for the colder months. The small camp was alive with purpose, each man playing a role in the complex rhythm of survival. Leif continued to lead with prudence and ambition. He organized hunting parties that moved deeper into the forests, charting rivers and valleys. These expeditions were essential, not only for sustenance, but also for mapping Vinland's terrain. Hunters returned with reports of abundant game, deer, elk, and small mammals, while rivers teemed with salmon and other fish. Yet danger lurked. Encounters with Skrælings reminded the Norse that Vinland was not an unclaimed paradise. Ambushes, though sporadic, required constant vigilance and strategic planning. Trade interactions, delicate and cautious, offered both opportunity and tension. The Norse displayed iron tools, red cloth, and dairy products, captivating the Skrælings with objects unfamiliar in their daily lives. In return, the Norse received pelts, furs, and guidance on navigating the dense forests and waterways. Yet the exchange was fragile. Every gift, every negotiation carried the risk of misunderstanding. Misplaced trust could quickly erupt into violence, as past skirmishes had demonstrated. Leif knew that diplomacy was as vital as strength. Daily life demanded both endurance and ingenuity. Timber from Vinland's vast forests was felled with careful precision, stored for building, and reserved for transport back to Greenland. Hunting and fishing ensured steady food supplies, but preservation was critical. Fish and meat were salted or smoked, berries gathered and stored, and temporary shelters reinforced against early winter winds. The Norse knew that preparation determined survival in this new world. The crew's routine included domestic chores alongside exploration. Men maintained fires, repaired clothing, and organized stores. Mealtimes became moments of shared reflection, where tales from Greenland and Iceland were exchanged with the dreams of Vinland's potential. These fireside gatherings also offered respite from the constant tension with the Skraelings, a chance to reinforce unity and morale among a small group facing a vast, unpredictable land. Leif's strategy for interacting with the Skraelings was one of cautious observation and measured engagement. Scouts learned the patterns of the natives' movements, noting seasonal behaviors and preferred hunting grounds. The Norse respected these boundaries while carefully extending their own presence. Trade continued in fits and starts, often interrupted by sudden skirmishes or misunderstandings. The Norse weapons, iron swords, axes and shields, served as deterrents as much as protection, ensuring that any aggression could be met with force if necessary. Seasonal changes brought new challenges. Early frosts threatened crops and wild edibles. The Norse had to ensure that food supplies were secured and shelters reinforced. Every day required labor, coordination and planning. Timber cut during the warmer months was essential not only for construction, but also for heating during the longer nights. The men worked tirelessly, guided by the knowledge that their survival depended on careful preparation and foresight. Encounters with Skraelings became more complex as both groups adjusted to each other's presence. Initially, tentative exchanges of goods and gestures of friendship gradually gave way to cautious tolerance. The Skraelings, skilled in forest navigation and ambush tactics, remained wary, observing the Norse from a distance and testing boundaries when opportunity arose. Each encounter reminded Leif that Vinland's riches, its forests, rivers and fertile soil, were not unclaimed, and that any permanent settlement would require careful negotiation and strategic positioning. Despite tension, the Norsemen continued to explore inland. Forests revealed wild grapes, blueberries and cranberries. Meadows suggested potential for livestock grazing, and fertile soil hinted at possibilities for crops. Each discovery reinforced both the potential and the peril of Vinland. The Norse realized that this land could sustain life, but only with discipline, cooperation, and respect for those already present. In addition to practical concerns, cultural exchanges began to emerge, subtle and cautious. Observing Skraelings' methods of hunting, fishing and foraging offered valuable insights into Vinland's ecology. The Norse shared knowledge of construction, toolmaking and navigation, laying the groundwork for possible collaboration or coexistence. Yet full trust remained elusive, and the spectre of conflict persisted. The balance between ambition and caution defined Leif's leadership. He encouraged exploration and resource gathering while maintaining strict vigilance. The Norse understood that they were guests in a land with established inhabitants. Every step into the forest or along the river required careful observation, an awareness of potential ambush, and readiness to defend the settlement if necessary. Autumn brought moments of reflection. The men considered the future. Could families be brought here? Could Vinland support permanent settlements? Discussions ranged from cautious hope to pragmatic assessment of risks. The forest offered resources, but the Skraelings' presence reminded them of their small numbers and limited ability to enforce control. The reality was clear. Vinland's wealth was real, but temporary occupation, rather than permanent colonization, was the immediate goal. Evenings were times of both planning and solace. Fires burned bright as men shared meals, exchanged stories and sang songs. Discussions of future exploration, resource management and potential interactions with the Skraelings shaped strategy. Bonds formed among the men strengthened morale, providing unity against both environmental challenges and the uncertainty posed by the native inhabitants. Hunting excursions became more ambitious. Small groups ventured further, tracking elk herds or scouting timber-rich areas. Each journey combined curiosity, necessity, and caution. Encounters with Skraelings were unpredictable. Arrows sometimes rained from hidden vantage points, and the Norse responded with force when pressed. These skirmishes reinforced the lesson that Vinland's abundance was accompanied by persistent risk. Daily survival required constant coordination. Firewood was collected and stacked for winter, food supplies organized, and temporary shelters maintained. The men learned from mistakes, improving techniques for preserving fish and meat, building more stable structures, and navigating the forests without provoking conflict. Vinland became both a classroom and a proving ground, shaping the skills and resilience of all who remained. The months passed, revealing the duality of Vinland, a land of opportunity intertwined with challenge. Rivers teemed with salmon, forests offered timber and game, and fertile soil promised sustenance. Yet the Skraelings' vigilance and occasional hostility reminded the Norse that the land was not theirs by right. Cooperation, caution, and adaptability were essential for any hope of survival or extended occupation. Leif's leadership ensured that the men remained disciplined, organized, and focused. Every day, resource gathering, exploration, and observation strengthened their understanding of Vinland and its inhabitants. The Norse learned to balance ambition with prudence, recognizing that the greatest threat to their settlement was not the land itself, but the dynamics of human interaction in an unfamiliar environment. As autumn deepened, the Norse camp reflected months of careful labor and adaptation. Shelters were secure, food stores sufficient, and knowledge of terrain and Skraelings' patterns invaluable. The promise of Vinland remained strong, yet the reality of contested land, small numbers, and environmental uncertainty weighed heavily on Leif and his men. The lessons of survival, diplomacy, and preparation were etched into every decision, shaping the enduring saga of Vinland's second chapter. The days grew shorter, and the warmth of autumn gradually gave way to the sharp bite of Vinland's early winter. Frost began to glaze the edges of rivers, and the once golden leaves of birch and maple fell, leaving skeletal branches silhouetted against pale skies. The Norse settlement, though small, stood resilient against the encroaching cold. Turf walls and timber structures provided insulation, and fires burned constantly, a source of both warmth and morale. Leif Ericson understood that the approaching winter would test the limits of their ingenuity and endurance. Every morning, men awoke to a landscape transformed, streams partially frozen, footprints of deer and elk etched in the snow, and the distant silhouette of Skraelings moving through the forests. Survival now required rigorous discipline. Hunting parties ventured carefully, ensuring that traps, snares, and fishing techniques maximized yields without drawing unnecessary attention from the native inhabitants. Meat was salted, smoked, and stored in insulated pits, while fish were preserved in layers of snow and ice to extend their shelf life. Timber, Vinland's most prized resource, continued to be harvested, but with added urgency. Winter would make transporting logs back to Greenland treacherous, so men worked from dawn until dusk, felling trees, shaping planks, and stockpiling supplies near the shore. Every log taken, every beam cut, was a testament to Norse skill and foresight. The work was laborious, demanding strength, coordination, and careful attention to safety in the slippery conditions. The Skraelings' presence remained a constant shadow over the settlement. While full-scale attacks were rare, small skirmishes and scouting encounters reminded the Norse that they were outsiders. Trade became increasingly fraught as the Skraelings became more wary, reluctant to approach during harsh weather, and cautious of the Norse's growing stockpile of resources. Leif, ever pragmatic, sought to minimize confrontations, instructing his men to observe, avoid unnecessary provocation, and maintain defensive positions near the camp. Daily routines adapted to the winter threat. Men reinforced shelters, repaired roofs, and insulated storage areas with layers of moss, turf, and bark. Fires were meticulously maintained, with watch shifts ensuring that the settlement would not be caught unprepared. Food rationing became a calculated practice, balancing immediate needs with the uncertain duration of winter. Even simple chores carried heightened importance. A missed task could mean exposure, hunger, or disaster. Exploration, though limited by snow and ice, continued to be a priority. Scouts mapped accessible terrain, marking safe routes to streams and hunting grounds. Observations of wildlife patterns informed future expeditions, revealing areas rich in game and zones avoided by predators. The Norse also monitored the Skraeling's movements, seeking patterns that might allow for safer interactions or potential trade opportunities in the following seasons. Evenings in the camp took on a reflective, almost ceremonial quality. Around the fires, men shared stories of past voyages, legends of Greenland and Iceland, and accounts of Norse heroes who had braved the oceans before them. These gatherings strengthened bonds among the crew, reinforcing unity and providing psychological sustenance as harsh winds howled outside. Leif's presence, steady and deliberate, offered reassurance. He emphasized the importance of patience, preparation, and vigilance, reinforcing that survival was the paramount goal. Strategic planning became central. Leif held councils to decide whether to attempt longer inland explorations, continue stockpiling resources for Greenland, or consider retreat if conditions worsened. Opinions varied among the men. Some argued for riskier ventures, hoping to secure more abundant timber or fertile lands. Others favored caution, emphasizing that even with Vinland's richness, their small numbers made them vulnerable to both environmental hazards and potential conflicts with the Skraelings. Tensions occasionally flared within the camp. Harsh conditions, combined with the stress of constant vigilance, tested nerves and patience. Minor disputes over responsibilities, hunting rights, or storage methods arose, but Leif's leadership maintained overall cohesion. Discipline, respect, and shared purpose prevented disagreements from escalating into deeper conflicts, a testament to the Norse understanding of community survival under extreme conditions. Scouting reports confirmed that Vinland's wildlife, though abundant, began migrating or burrowing as winter deepened. Salmon runs slowed, deer herds moved to denser cover, and smaller mammals grew scarce. The Norse adapted by relying more heavily on stored provisions and supplementing with foraged roots, nuts, and berries preserved from autumn. Observations of Skraelings revealed increased mobility as they adjusted to the season, likely moving between hunting grounds and winter encampments. The Norse also turned attention to the longer-term viability of Vinland. Could a permanent settlement withstand seasonal extremes, limited manpower, and native resistance? Discussions reflected a balance between hope and pragmatism. The land's fertility, timber, and resources were undeniable, yet the reality of defending and sustaining a community in such an isolated, contested environment remained daunting. Leif weighed each factor carefully, understanding that decisions made now could determine survival or disaster. Preparations for the eventual return voyage began subtly. Timber and resources destined for Greenland were organized, packed, and secured aboard the Nar. Provisions were inventoried, with a focus on items that could endure the ocean journey. Hunting and foraging continued, not only for immediate consumption, but also to provide additional supplies for the voyage. Every action reflected the dual nature of the Norse mission: exploration and prudent retreat, if necessary. Winter nights brought both challenge and opportunity. Stars illuminated the snow-covered landscape, and the northern constellations guided scouts and hunters. Moonlight revealed animal tracks and pathways through the forests. Fires within the settlement became symbols of resilience, life, and hope, their smoke curling into the crisp night air as a reminder of human ingenuity against the indifferent forces of nature. As days shortened further, the Norse settlement developed a rhythm of endurance. Tasks were rotated to prevent exhaustion, watch shifts ensured security, and communal meals reinforced morale. Stories, songs, and shared reflection provided psychological sustenance, reinforcing the collective resolve needed to endure Vinland's winter months. The men were no longer merely visitors, they were participants in the ongoing struggle to adapt, survive, and understand this new land. Despite caution, the temptation of Vinland's bounty persisted. Scouts reported wild grapes still clinging to vines, small game visible among the thinning foliage, and timber ideal for construction. Each discovery reminded the Norse of the land's potential, fueling ambition tempered by practicality. Leif's guidance emphasized measured exploitation, gather enough to benefit, but never so much as to provoke unnecessary conflict or overextend their limited manpower. Interactions with the Skraelings during winter became minimal yet significant. Both groups seemed to respect an unspoken boundary, though occasional scouting parties observed each other from a distance. The Norse noted practices, territories, and hunting patterns, learning to navigate without confrontation. This cautious coexistence underscored the reality that Vinland's occupation was temporary and contingent, dependent on discipline, preparation, and strategic restraint. As winter deepened, the Norse reflected on the lessons of Vinland. The land offered abundance, yet it demanded respect, foresight, and adaptability. Strength alone could not guarantee survival. Wisdom, unity, and careful planning were equally vital. Leif's leadership ensured that these principles guided every decision, balancing ambition with caution, curiosity with pragmatism. The approaching winter clarified priorities. Survival, resource collection, and preparation for potential return to Greenland dominated daily life. The Norse understood that Vinland's riches, while real, could not justify unnecessary risk. Every day of labor, vigilance, and adaptation strengthened the settlement, preserved their lives, and cemented the narrative of Vinland as a land of both promise and challenge, a testament to the resilience of those who dared cross the Atlantic. The Norse had endured autumn and early winter in Vinland with discipline and resourcefulness, yet as the cold deepened, the reality of their precarious position became impossible to ignore. The land was generous, offering forests, rivers teeming with fish, and fertile meadows, but its abundance could not shield them from the social and strategic complexities they now faced. The Skraelings, always present in the background, became increasingly bold. Their movements were cautious yet deliberate, signaling that they had grown aware of the Norse presence in a sustained way. Leif Ericson convened councils within the turf houses, discussing strategies with his trusted lieutenants. The men understood that continued occupation was no longer simply about survival against nature. It was about maintaining peace, or at least avoiding violent escalation, with a people who had intimate knowledge of the terrain. Maps and observations from scouting expeditions were spread across rough-hewn tables, each marking rivers, forest clearings, and areas where wild game concentrated. The goal was clear: avoid confrontation while continuing to gather resources. Hunting and fishing expeditions became increasingly methodical. Deer, elk, and waterfowl were pursued with extreme care, always considering the likelihood of Skraeling encounters. Hunting parties traveled in small, disciplined units, leaving markers and signs to ensure safe passage back to the settlement. The rivers, once abundant with salmon, required more patience as migration patterns changed with the cooling weather. The men salted and smoked what they caught, preserving their bounty against both winter scarcity and the journey back to Greenland. Trade interactions, once tentative, had all but ceased. The Skraelings, wary of the Norse and protective of their resources, avoided direct contact, leaving small tracts of land temporarily unoccupied. The Norse observed, recorded, and respected these patterns, understanding that attempting to force exchanges could provoke unnecessary violence. Leif's pragmatic leadership emphasized restraint. The Norse were far from home, with a limited population and no immediate reinforcements. Every encounter with the Skraelings needed careful consideration, as misjudgment could result in loss of life or resources. Within the settlement, life maintained a disciplined rhythm. Men and women continued to perform tasks essential for survival, reinforcing turf walls against the wind, stacking firewood, and maintaining tools. Children, if any were present among accompanying families, were kept safe within sheltered areas, learning the ways of Norse life in a new land. Communal meals, often of preserved fish and gathered berries, reinforced morale and offered opportunities for Leif and his lieutenants to communicate plans and share guidance. Every action was intentional, every decision a matter of survival and prudence. Winter nights were long and psychologically challenging. Snow and ice blanketed the land, and winds howled through the forests and over the shoreline. Fires became lifelines, centers of warmth, light, and social cohesion. Around these flames, men exchanged tales of Greenland and Iceland, stories of exploration, and accounts of their hardships. Songs and legends reinforced identity and purpose, reminding all that while Vinland was foreign and challenging, they carried the traditions and resilience of Norse society within them. As weeks passed, Leif observed that Vinland's resources, though plentiful, would not sustain a permanent colony without significant reinforcements. Timber, while abundant, required manpower to fell, process, and transport. Game, though available, was finite in the immediate vicinity of the settlement, and overhunting could easily provoke scarcity or drive wildlife into more distant forests. The Norse realized that without a larger, organized population and stable relations with local inhabitants, the dream of a lasting settlement remained fragile. Encounters with the Skraelings continued in shadowed ways. Occasionally, the Norse would observe tracks in snow or glimpses of figures moving cautiously along forest edges. Both groups seemed to test boundaries, asserting presence without direct confrontation. Leif instructed his men to respect these signals, understanding that patience and observation were more valuable than aggression. Attempting to dominate the land with force was neither practical nor strategically wise. The psychological impact of these limitations was palpable. Some men expressed frustration, desiring to expand the settlement, plant crops, or stake a permanent claim. Others voiced caution, emphasizing the need to preserve life and resources until conditions allowed a safer, more sustainable presence. Leif mediated these tensions with the steady pragmatism that had guided him throughout the voyage. His vision balanced ambition with the sober recognition of reality. Vinland's gifts were generous, but they came with constraints that could not be ignored. Even as the Norse continued to adapt, winter brought unique challenges. Heavy snowfall obstructed paths, froze streams, and limited hunting and foraging options. The cold tested the integrity of turf walls, the durability of clothing, and the endurance of every man and woman in the camp. Leif coordinated shifts in work and watch, ensuring that no one was overexposed and that essential tasks, fire maintenance, supply management, and security, remained uninterrupted. Adaptation became survival, and survival became the highest priority. Throughout this period, Leif considered the long-term legacy of Vinland. While the land could sustain life, he recognized the logistical and social realities that made permanent colonization improbable for a small group. The Norse had achieved remarkable feats, crossing the Atlantic, discovering new shores, and establishing temporary habitation. But the establishment of a lasting community required numbers, alliances, and the ability to coexist with the native inhabitants. He documented his observations meticulously, knowing that the knowledge gained could inform future expeditions and contribute to the collective memory of Norse exploration. Interactions with the Skraelings, though cautious, were instructive. Observing their hunting techniques, territorial movements, and seasonal adaptations provided valuable intelligence for the Norse. Leif ensured that these lessons were recorded, creating a mental map of the land's inhabitants and ecosystems. He understood that knowledge was as vital as timber or fish, and that insight into the human and natural landscape was a strategic asset for any future ventures. Preparations for eventual departure became more systematic. Timber, grapevines, and preserved food were organized for transport aboard the Nar. Decisions about which materials to prioritize reflected the dual nature of their mission: resource gathering for immediate survival and return to Greenland, and the hope that future Norse expeditions might leverage these experiences to establish a more permanent presence. The process required careful calculation, balancing what could be carried with what was left behind to sustain temporary occupation. Evenings during these weeks were reflective, marked by discussions around the fires about what Vinland represented. The land symbolized discovery, opportunity, and the limits of human endeavor in unknown territories. Stories of encounters, observations of flora and fauna, and lessons from Skraeling interactions were shared among men and women alike. These narratives reinforced cultural identity, transmitted practical knowledge, and preserved the collective memory of what it meant to live at the edge of the known world. By late winter, the Norse settlement had adapted to its seasonal rhythm, yet the limitations of population size, resources, and potential conflicts with Skraelings became increasingly clear. Leif's leadership emphasized prudence. They had succeeded in exploration, documentation, and temporary habitation. But the establishment of a permanent colony required more than bravery. It required numbers, alliances, and the capacity to defend a contested territory. These realizations tempered ambition with strategic foresight. As the days remained short and the northern winds intensified, the Norse prepared for the eventual journey back to Greenland. The decision was not one of failure, but of practicality. Vinland's gifts were undeniable, yet survival, knowledge, and the preservation of life were paramount. Timber was stacked, provisions secured, and the Nar readied for the crossing. Every man and woman understood that their achievements, while temporary in physical presence, had lasting significance for Norse society. Proof of new lands, insight into human and environmental dynamics, and a foundation for the stories that would endure in saga. The story of Vinland during this phase reflects the duality of Norse exploration: triumph and caution, discovery and limitation. The land offered riches, yet it demanded respect and wisdom. Encounters with the Skraelings reinforced that settlement was not merely a matter of conquest, but of negotiation, adaptation, and understanding of the local human landscape. Leif Ericson's decisions embodied the balance between ambition and prudence, ensuring that the Norse legacy in Vinland would be remembered not only for what was achieved, but for the wisdom demonstrated in recognizing limits. In the end, Part 10 of Vinland's saga portrays the intricate interplay of opportunity, danger, and foresight. The Norse learned that discovery extended beyond mere geography. It encompassed the management of resources, relations with inhabitants, and the endurance of human spirit against environmental and social challenges. These lessons would resonate across generations, shaping the narrative of Norse exploration and preserving the memory of a land both abundant and contested, a land forever known as Vinland.